I think all the time of the human part of reparation on the one hand and the non-human on the other, and then the way that the term joins them up so that we start to see that they are not completely separate and they have to be connected. So on the human side, I think this has to do with the history of colonialism and the longer histories of the different ways that inequality has become sedimented through relationships anchored into colonial power, and these things need repair in the sense of restoration. They need to be reworked in order to be able to create futures that are expansive and that enable different voices to speak and don't leave us stuck in particular patterns of inequality. And that involves literal reparations, economic reparations, returning things, returning land. And but then on the other hand is the ecological part of reparation, which is recognizing that we are destroying the earth slowly or in increasingly accelerated ways, and the waters, the soils, the relationships between humans and animals have become seriously degraded. So we need to do different kinds of repair. We need to look not just at single issues, but the ways they're connected together. And I think what I love about the idea of ecological reparation is joining together the human and the non-human, and thinking how post-colonial and decolonial work on relationships and power and land might be connected with imagining an earth that isn't just going downhill, then in some sense is able to repair itself.
I was wondering about this particular work you've done. I've seen that it shows how different ways of taking care of soils that are about alternatives to industrial agricultural systems and the damage they've done, but they are also about experimentation. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more what you mean by experimentation in this context.
One of the places I've worked is El Salvador, which is a context which has been very affected by its history of colonialism and then also of civil war. And so in the rural landscape, there's a strong feeling of dispossession, alienation, and also the soils are very degraded. It's not a place that has big national parks and forest that's intact. It's been very heavily industrialized and it's got a very large population for the size of its land. And the soil has really been quite wrecked through green revolution type technologies, particularly the overuse of fertilizer. So there's a growing organic movement that's very much led by the campesinos, by the peasants, to take back, in a sense, those the land itself, but also the right to know and the right to be someone who's experimenting with what should happen to it. Because historically, it's been US fertilizer companies, US development agencies, and so on, with the state who's decided this program is going to count for all of you. So we see the development of these quite initially ad hoc and small scale groups across the country, as across other parts of Central America, starting to share knowledge. And actually, agroecology reached the areas where I worked via a series of exchanges that took place with Guatemala, including with some indigenous groups, to build networks, to have training schools, to open seminars, to talk to people about understanding soil science from a different point of view that includes engaging with the longer history of the land and the longer history of knowledge in the land. So I think it's really important because sometimes when we're talking about rural experimentation, there's this tendency to romanticize, the natural and sort of ways of repair that are all about the past and indigeneity and tradition. And actually that is part of the process, because through these sort of exchanges, these growing agroecology schools and networks, you do get people connecting with indigenous traditions and trying them out, but they test them. People do things like planting up twin plots, as you also might do in permaculture, and being taught a technique and then trying it out, or mapping your land to see what gradients you've got and what species you've got, and then creating a design that works with what is there already. But it's always about testing. It's always about, let me try this and then look at the result, and then knowledge sharing based on that experimentation. And it is itself a form of science. So, as I was saying, as it grows through Mexico, this network of people who don't really agree or are getting uncomfortable with the Green Revolution technology, you get people starting to find ways of systematizing that knowledge, sharing it with other people. And one of the examples I look at is the mode of composting that gets developed, which for me becomes a kind of metaphor for the whole process, which is called bokashi.
Bueno, acá, ¿verdad? La tierra, pues, es un elemento muy importante, ¿verdad? Porque tiene lo que es micros y macroorganismos. La gallinaza, pues, contiene lo que es potasio, calcio, fósforo y zinc. El maicillo contiene lo que es potasio, lo que es la flecha de maicillo. Lo que es la flecha de sonpopo contiene hongos benéficos que ayudan también a la descomposición de los materiales. También lo que es la melaza, lo que es el potasio y da energía a los microorganismos. También tenemos huerta, le pusimos tallo de huerta y eso contiene lo que es potasio y fósforo. Y son abonos verdes, que eso pues es, como no tenemos lo que es hoja de planta leguminosa como madre cacao, entonces le pusimos lo que es...
The idea that I think is partly my own is imagining soil as a kind of archive, as a kind of memory of its own. So that is literal. When you add chemicals to the land, it does change it, and that lasts in important ways. When you cultivate microbial communities, that produces a kind of repair that goes on repairing. And actually, people have talked about something quite similar using Donna Haraway's idea of composting. There's this idea that in the soil there's the potential for something which maybe is like not working very well, or you think you might get rid of it, to become something new. But in order to do that, you don't just leave it, and that sometimes a bit of leaving is necessary, but nor can you just sort of fix it. You have to sort of work with it. You have to understand its matter. You have to engage with it. You have to observe it. You have to witness it to a certain degree. You have to see what it needs. And what I like about bokashi is it kind of uses materials that are at hand to create a sort of remediation, to create an extra loop that can work with quite degraded soils. And bokashi is seen by some of the people I worked with as their local food security. It's a very effective mode of making compost, where you layer up your actual compost, they call it abono, that you've left underground for a while, with other ingredients like yeast and different kinds of animal manure and so on. And then you let it all heat up, and then it's this kind of activated compost. And you can make it entirely out of things you can find locally, so it's very cheap. I mean, it's free. But what's interesting to learn is the recipe was devised in Japan. So people see it as this kind of like, this is part of our resistance, our cultural repair, our ecological healing, but it's very much part of this new transnational circuit of knowledge exchange and experimentation, which is moving around the world, where people are trying out new things and exchanging them with each other. It has a kind of texture, it has a quality that fits with what people are doing locally, but actually it's an entirely new tradition. It's something that's created through new technologies and new kinds of experimentation. So it felt important to people to be trying to revive, to remember, to kind of piece together the longer history of the land as part of the process, and alongside repairing the soil itself. And I think people often talked about it as a kind of act of reclaiming. But it's also an act of survival, because people lived from these soils, so they needed to be repaired in order for people to be able to thrive. Some of the other people who talk about this either in more poetic or more literal ways would be people like Edouard Glissant, or Fanon even. Frantz Fanon doesn't talk so much about the practical work of repairing the soil, but he very much connects land and the right to land with the possibility of post-colonial liberation. And there are some sentences in his work that kind of link that to the soil and the wretched of the earth. So I think, there's a bit of poetic connection there between the soil itself and the land. So I'm kind of bringing that together. But many of those post-colonial or anti-colonial agronomists specifically then get into the specifics of what it means to care for the soil. And from that, we can have a kind of incipient idea of ecological healing being connected to decolonial restoration.
And I think one of the things that I was interested in is in how the restoration of forms of knowledge that have been oppressed, colonized, or hidden, or made go underground or invisible, become intrinsic part of a practice of reparation. So it really made me think, actually reclaiming all this knowledge is really intrinsically part of what we need to do if we want to do some kind of ecological reparation. So I don't know if you could talk about this a bit.
So I see the two things of the liberation pedagogy and the inquiry process as being very closely tied. And that is how you get the loop into the kind of material world, because liberation might well be based in lots of ideas, but if you're constantly having a loop where you're inquiring, testing, and producing evidence, then you are also producing ways of repairing that are based in how things are materially in the social world, but also, as we see in agroecology, in the material world in relation to soils and in relation to growing practices, or sometimes then, as your work shows, Dimitris, in relation to technologies and trying out how technologies work. So I do think that this provides a kind of basis for thinking through what some of us call commoning, creating ways of working together to repair things that are expansive, that create a kind of social basis from which to work, and that are always expanding the community of those who take part in that. Commoning, which is the verb, I prefer to use the verb, is about creating or recreating ways of doing things that are an alternative to private property. It's a different starting point. And the starting point is that sharing can be great, sharing is possible, there are rules when you have kind of a commons that operate well, and thinking about commons in a way that is more than human and breaks down the relationship between that's the land and that's the people, and the resource is the relation, that imagines different kinds of relation, but also that starts to think about the ways that ecological repair might be connected to different kinds of social transformations and alternative ways of relating together that aren't solely based in the capital relation and ideas of ownership.